Why does the piano keyboard look the way it does? Why are some keys raised and others not? Why do some scales and chords require completely different fingerings when you move from one key to another? And why does playing a higher or lower passage often require your hands to make a large leap sideways across the keyboard? Well, in 1882, Paul von Janko designed a completely different piano keyboard. It had 6 staggered rows of keys. Every scale had the same fingering in every key. Can you imagine that? Every chord kept the same shape when you transposed it. And large intervals could be reached with smaller hands. In other words, it was designed to make the piano more logical, but almost nobody uses it today. So, was the Janko keyboard a bad idea? Or was it simply too logical for the world that had to adapt it? Welcome to Living Pianos. Robert Estrin here with one of the most fascinating alternate piano designs ever created. Now, I want to be careful with this subject. It would be easy to just say that Janko keyboard was simply better than the traditional keyboard. And there are certainly things about it that appear more logical. But a piano keyboard is not just a collection of notes. It's also a physical interface, a teaching system, a notation system, a manufacturing system, and a lifetime of muscle memory. So today, we're going to look at how the Janko keyboard worked, why it seems so rational, what problems it was designed to solve, and why a design that offered such consistent fingering never replaced the familiar keyboard. Because here's the really interesting question. Does the best design win? Or does the design that everybody has already learned win? Let's begin with the traditional piano keyboard. Most of us accept this layout without thinking about it. There are white keys and black keys. The black keys are arranged in groups of 2 and 3. The pattern repeats across the keyboard. It's so familiar to every pianist, but it isn't geometrically uniform. The distance between neighboring notes is not represented in exactly the same way everywhere. Sometimes you move from a white key to an adjacent white key. Sometimes you move from a white key to a black key, and sometimes there's no black key between 2 neighboring white keys. That is why the pattern of whole steps and half steps feels different in different keys. For example, C major uses only the white keys, but if you play the same major scale in D flat major, your hand is working with a completely different visual and physical pattern. The notes are still organized according to the same musical interval structure, but your fingers are not encountering the same keyboard shape. These 2 scales sound the same in terms of their major scale structure, but they feel very different under your fingers. The fingering changes, the visual pattern changes, the black and white geography changes, and when you play chords, the shapes change as you move through different keys. Now, this isn't necessarily a flaw. The traditional keyboard has many advantages. The groups of black keys give pianists tactile landmarks. You can find your way around the keyboard without constantly looking down. The layout also connects directly with traditional Western notation, which is organized around 7-note diatonic scales. But from a purely geometric standpoint, the keyboard is not uniform. It's a historical design that developed over centuries, and Paul von Janko believed it could be redesigned. Paul von Janko was a Hungarian pianist and engineer. In 1882, he introduced a new keyboard layout intended to overcome some of the physical and musical limitations of the conventional piano keyboard. Instead of 1 row of white keys with raised black keys, the Janko keyboard used 6 staggered rows. The keys were smaller, and the rows are arranged so that the same musical relationships repeated across the entire keyboard. The result looks unusual, almost like a cross between a piano keyboard and a typewriter. But the important idea is not simply that there were more rows. the important idea is that the layout was isomorphic. That sounds technical, but the concept is simple. An isomorphic keyboard gives the same physical pattern for the same musical interval, no matter what key you're playing in. If you're learning the shape of a major chord in one key, that same shape can be moved to another key. If you learn a major scale in one place, the same fingering can be used everywhere else. Can you imagine being able to play all your major scales in the same fingering? The musical pattern is only the starting position changes. A standard Janko keyboard has 6 staggered rows of keys. In the design described in the historical material, each note appears in multiple positions. In particular, a vertical group of 3 key surfaces can operate the same underlying piano key. That's strange, huh? So the player has several possible places to reach the same pitch. The keyboard isn't creating 3 different sounds, it's giving the performer 3 different physical access points to the same note. Now, this is important because it allows the hands to follow a more consistent geometric pattern. Instead of being forced to travel broadly from side to side for every interval, the player can often move through rows. The layout gives the hand additional vertical options. The hand can remain more compact, and because the keys were smaller, the proponents claim that intervals such as tenths, and in some cases even larger intervals, could become more accessible to average-sized hands. I want to phrase that carefully. This doesn't mean that every pianist would automatically find the Janko keyboard comfortable. But what it does mean is that the design was intended to reduce some of the large lateral stretches built into the traditional keyboard. And this is where the title of this video comes from. The Janko keyboard was not designed around the historical pattern pianists were already used to. It was designed around the mathematical relationships between pitches. Let's look at one of the biggest promises of the Janko keyboard. On the conventional keyboard, the fingering of a scale depends on the key. C major has one familiar fingering, F major has another, B major has another, D flat major has another. A pianist eventually learns all of these patterns. But the one universal physical system, the pianist is learning a collection of exceptions. On an isomorphic keyboard, the goal is different. The same interval produces the same physical relationship. The same chord produces the same shape. The same scale pattern can be moved to another starting note without changing the fundamental fingering. Wouldn't that be a pleasure? So if you learn a major scale in one key, you would not have to learn a completely new hand pattern for every other key. This is a very powerful idea. It could make transposition just effortless. It could make chord relationships easier to see and feel, and it could make certain kinds of improvisation more systematic. Instead of thinking, this is the fingering for E flat major, you could think, this is the major scale pattern. The pattern itself would remain stable. Think how much time this would save you in learning all scales and arpeggios. There's another potential advantage. The traditional keyboard often requires the hand to move sideways to reach higher and lower notes. That's natural because the keyboard is essentially one long horizontal line, but the Janko design distributes the notes across several rows. This means that going from higher or lower in pitch doesn't require the same large lateral movement. The hands can move diagonally, vertically, or through adjacent rows. The multiple rows also give the player more than one location for the same pitch. Think about that. This can create additional fingering options. A pianist could choose the location that best fits the passage being played. For example, one position might be convenient for a scale, another might be better for a chord, and yet another might make a large leap easier to reach. In theory, this could make the keyboard more adaptable to the shape of the hand. The design could also make larger intervals more accessible. Some descriptions of Janko keyboard claim that average-sized hands could reach intervals that would be much more difficult on a conventional keyboard. Again, this is a claim about the design's potential, not a guarantee for every player, but a keyboard can reduce the physical distance between notes. But it can't eliminate every issue of hand shape, strength, or coordination, or technique. Still, the central idea is compelling. What if the keyboard were designed to fit the player instead of requiring the player to adapt to a historical layout? Now, you might be thinking, this sounds wonderful. Why wouldn't every pianist want this? Well, the Janko keyboard introduced its own problems. The first problem was mechanical. The keyboard with multiple rows and several key surfaces connected to the same underlying lever. Man, that has to manage the relationship between the player's finger, the piano mechanism. Depending on which row is pressed, the finger may contact the key at a different distance from the internal pivot point. That can affect leverage. It may also create differences in perceived touch weight between rows. A well-designed system could compensate for these differences, but that would require additional engineering. So the design that simplified the musical geometry could complicate the mechanical geometry. That's an important trade-off. The Janko's keyboard was not a magical solution. It moved certain problems from one part of the instrument to another. The second problem was notation. Traditional Western music notation is largely diatonic, note-to-note, like scalular. It's built around 7 letter names, A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. The conventional piano keyboard reflects that organization. The white keys correspond to the basic letter names. The black keys represent sharps and flats, as you well know. The visual is something, but the Janko keyboard is organized around a uniform 12-tone pattern. From a physical and mathematical standpoint, that could be more consistent, but when you play standard sheet music above it, the relationship becomes less direct. Now, a pianist who already knows traditional notation has to translate what is on the page into a completely different physical layout. The notes on the page haven't changed, the music hasn't changed, but the physical geography underneath the music has changed dramatically. This creates a serious cognitive hurdle. The Janko keyboard may make the physical pattern more uniform, but it doesn't automatically make reading traditional music easier. The third problem was tactile navigation. Pianists don't use their eyes alone. We use our fingers to understand where we are. The groups of 2 and 3 black keys provide landmarks. Even when you're not looking directly at the keyboard, you can feel the geography of the instrument. You know where you are because the patterns give you information. The Janko keyboard removes those familiar landmarks. Its uniformity is one of its strengths, but that same uniformity can also make the keyboard feel all alike, all the keys. A beginning learning the Janko system might eventually develop an entirely new tactile map. That's the hope, I guess, right? But an established pianist would have to give up the map already stored in their hands. And that brings us to the largest obstacle of all. By the late 19th century, the conventional piano keyboard was not merely designed, it was an entire ecosystem. Millions of people have already learned it, teachers taught it, conservatories taught it, composers wrote music for it, and publishers printed music for it. Manufacturers built instruments around it, and technicians learned how to repair it, and pianists had invested years or entire lifetimes in developing muscle memory for it. For the Janko keyboard to succeed, it wouldn't be enough just for the design to be promising. It would have to persuade everyone to start over. That's a very different challenge, isn't it? A new pianist might be able to learn the Janko keyboard right from the beginning, but what about pianists who'd spent 10 years learning the conventional keyboard? What about a teacher who had built an entire career around conventional technique? And what about a composer writing music for millions of existing pianos? What about a manufacturer that would have to produce a new action, new key structure, new cases? My gosh, new teaching materials, new repair procedures. The Janko keyboard was not only competing against another arrangement of keys, it was competing against history. This is what economists and technology historians often call an installed base. The more people use a particular system, the more valuable that system becomes. Not necessarily because it's the most elegant, but because everything around it supports it. A conventional piano can be sold to a student because teachers know how to teach it. A technician can service it because the parts and procedures are familiar. And a composer can write for it because the instrument is available everywhere. A pianist can move from one piano to another because the layout is standardized. The Janko keyboard had to build an entirely separate network, and that network would have to become large enough to support itself. That is why technically attractive systems often fail. The problem isn't always that the new design is worse. The problem is that the cost of switching is greater than the immediate benefit. And in the case of the Janko keyboard, switching was paid almost by everybody who had learned the piano. If you enjoy looking at the hidden decisions behind piano design, consider subscribing to Living Pianos. This channel isn't only about how to play the notes, it's about understanding why the piano became the instrument we know and love today, and what alternatives were lost along the way. The Janko keyboard didn't disappear because nobody noticed it. The design attracted attention in Europe, the United States. Companies including Decker Brothers in New York actually built pianos using the Janko arrangement around the late 1880s and early 1890s. And believe it or not, there are surviving examples that you could find in museums. Now, this is really important because this wasn't merely a theoretical drawing. People actually built instruments. People played them. And the design was serious enough to attract public interest and commercial experimentation. Later accounts also associated the keyboard with major pianists, including Franz Liszt and Anton Rubinstein. You'll sometimes see dramatic quotations attributed to these figures, including predictions that the keyboard would eventually replace the traditional layout. Those quotations are repeated frequently, but I would want to verify the original sources before presenting any of them as exact quotes. The safer conclusion is that the Janko keyboard was taken seriously enough to be discussed, demonstrated, promoted, and actually built. But attention isn't the same thing as adaption. For the Janko keyboard to become standard, several things would have had to happen at the same time. Manufacturers would have to commit to producing it. Teachers would have needed to develop a complete method. Students would have to overcome, the familiar keyboard. And publishers would have to create teaching materials and perhaps new notation systems. Concert pianists would have needed to demonstrate that the design was not merely a novelty, and enough of the public would have needed to believe that the benefits justified the cost of retraining. That's an enormous burden for any new instrument. The conventional piano, meanwhile, continued to improve. Pianists became more skilled at working around its irregularities, and teachers developed sophisticated fingering systems like in Hanon. Composers used the keyboard's limitations creatively. And the very fact that the traditional layout was difficult became part of the piano education. The technical challenge of executing large leaps on a traditional keyboard captivated audiences, but much of that visual excitement would be lost on the more ergonomic Janko keyboard. Students learned to navigate its exceptions. They learned different fingerings and different keys. They learned to recognize the groups of black keys. They learned how to make the instrument work. Once enough people have adapted to a system, its weaknesses become invisible. They no longer experience as design problems, they're experienced as technique. So is the Janko keyboard actually better? The honest answer depends on what we mean by better. From a geometric standpoint, it offers a remarkable degree of consistency. The same intervals can have the same shapes. Transposition becomes simple. Large reaches become effortless, and the player has more physical options for reaching the same pitch. From an educational standpoint, however, the transition could be extremely difficult. I can't even imagine having to relearn everything. And existing notation doesn't automatically map neatly onto the new layout. Existing pianists lose their tactile landmarks, those black keys. Teachers have to develop new methods, and the entire musical ecosystem has to support the change. From an engineering standpoint, the multiple rows also introduce their own challenges. The relationship between the finger, the key surface, and the underlying action has to remain consistent. If the leverage or the touch weight changes from one row to another, the mechanism must compensate. So the Janko keyboard may have solved some problems while creating new ones. That doesn't make it a failure as an invention, but it does make it a real invention. Real invention. And real inventions always involve trade-offs. Now here's the surprising part. The exact Janko piano keyboard didn't become the standard acoustic piano layout, but the underlying idea didn't disappear completely. Isomorphic layouts, like on the Janko keyboard, they live on accordions actually. They also appear in modern electronic instruments and controllers. You know, instruments such as have you seen the chromatone or the lumitone and the Linstrument? That's a far cry from the Linn drums from the 1980s. They use layouts that allow musical relationships to remain more consistent across the keys, just like the Janko keyboard. They're grid-based controllers. These modern instruments don't all copy the Janko design exactly, but they share an important principle. The physical layout doesn't have to reproduce the historical black and white key arrangement. It can be designed to run interval patterns and consistent relationships. In that sense, the Janko keyboard was not completely wrong. It may simply have been early. The technology, it was not ready to support the change. And the people who would have had to adapt it were already deeply invested in the old system. The Janko keyboard teaches us something much bigger than an alternative way to arrange piano keys. You know, it shows that technology doesn't develop in a vacuum. A design can be logical, it can be elegant, it can solve genuine problems, and it can still fail. Because people don't adapt isolated designs, they adapt systems. The traditional piano keyboard was supported by teachers, composers, music publishers, conservatories and manufacturers, technicians, of course performers, and millions of people already knew how to use it. The Janko keyboard had to challenge all of them. And that is why the title isn't the better piano keyboard. The title is the piano keyboard that was too logical. Its logic wasn't necessarily enough to overcome the cost of change. The Janko keyboard tried to make the physical arrangement of the piano reflect the mathematical structure of music, but pianists aren't mathematical structures. They're people with habits and training and memories, investments and expectations, and those human factors are part of every technology. The next time you sit and look at a piano keyboard, notice how much history is built into it. The groups of 2 and 3 black keys are not simply an arrangement of plastic and wood. They're a result of centuries of musical tradition. They determine how pianists learn. They influence how composers write. And they shape the way teachers explain harmony and technique. They make the piano instantly recognizable to almost everyone. But recognizable doesn't necessarily mean inevitable. The piano could have developed differently. Its action could have developed differently, and its keyboard could have been more uniform, more compact, and more consistent from one key to another. The Janko keyboard reminds us that the design we inherit is not necessarily the only design that could work. It may simply be the design that accumulated the most history. And once a technology has enough history behind it, replacing it becomes much harder than investing something new. It's much like the QWERTY keyboard used on computers that came from typewriters. There are more efficient layouts that place most of the frequently used letters right in the middle in easier to reach positions, allowing the faster typing. But the sheer inertia of the established QWERTY system makes widespread change just about impossible. I wouldn't want to relearn typing. I'm really interested in your opinion. Would you be willing to relearn the piano on a Janko keyboard if it gave you the same fingering patterns in every key and make large leaps nearly effortless? Or would the traditional keyboard still be your choice because of its tactile landmarks, established repertoire, and familiar relationship with music notation? Let me know in the comments here at livingpianos.com or on YouTube. I'm Robert Estrin. Thanks for watching and keep playing.